So, hello everybody, and a big thanks for organising this event for a wonderful man, and I think particular thanks are due to Joanna, although I'm sure many people have been involved. I've seen from the flow of emails how much the commitment has been. So I'm Alan Freeman. I'm recording this for two reasons. One is that I'm going to try and take part in a Skype session at your conference, and I hope that succeeds, because obviously I want to listen and take part in discussion. But just in case the technology fails, because it does, I'm just going to record this so that if all else fails you can play this. Or maybe you play it anyway and then I'll join the discussion, since there may be, some function in not repeating the same exercise twice. And second, it's a record, and I think a record is one of the things that we want for who Fred was and what he achieved. Fred was very formative in my conversion or my involvement in pluralism and heterodox economics in general. It's not to say I wasn't heterodox before I was Marxist, but I didn't think of that as heterodox, I just thought of it as Marxist. And he became very instrumental in getting me involved in the discussions that have led to and have taken place through the activities of the AEG. I thought he'd made a tremendous difference to economics in Britain, in a certain sense, in the world. He brought heterodoxy into being, and although he wasn't the only person who achieved that or took part in it, it was a collaborative effort. He was a catalyst. He's one of these rare individuals in history who comes along at the right point in time and does the right thing and makes it all happen. So, since we're remembering Fred, what are we trying to remember? Well, I think what we're trying to remember is those parts of what Fred achieved and what he was that will serve as useful. I mean, there's a hackneyed word, role model. I would recommend Fred as a role model for anybody, lovely as he was. He was one of a kind, but there are certain things that he did and certain characteristics he had which I think are worth imitating. So I sat and reflected and thought, well, what were they? What particularly from the standpoint of doing what we do, developing heterodox economics, developing pluralism in economics, and I think, basically rescuing economics from the mess it's in, if indeed it can be rescued, and if it can't, then give it a proper burial and create something better in its place. In achieving that, in trying to do that, it's important to think what it was that what are the things that Fred did that we might want to ourselves do, and we might want to encourage the growing body of students, a wonderful testimony to Fred's work, who are committed to pluralism and a different way of doing economics, what they might learn from it as well. And I think that's very important, because they're at the very early stage and already doing wonderful things. By looking at Fred, maybe they can do even better things. So two characteristics of Fred struck me from the beginning. One is something for which he's probably well known, you've all come across it one way or another, is his doggedness, his persistence, his basically he doesn't give up. He never gave up. But the second thing, which is a rare complement to that, he had a capacity to change his mind, which is very, very rare in economists of my experience, including heterodox economists. I think one of the ways that monotheoreticism operates on the economic mind, capital E, capital M, is to make it immune to the idea it could possibly be wrong. It could be wrong, I think, is the way that people think within a very narrow set of parameters, which is the field of study we've adopted, the method we've chosen, and the conclusion that we generally have built our careers around, that people have built their careers around, the conclusions for which they are known. People are very unwilling to depart from something that they have made their mind up to do if they're economists. Fred was willing to change his mind, and there were a couple of very important occasions in which he did change his mind, and I think that's one of the characteristics that one should add to what a good economist should be, along with pluralism, listening to others, inductive method, using facts as a primary source of information about judging what's true and what's false, rather than Cartesian closed system reasoning, as Sheila and Vicky have rightly pointed out to us. being able to change your mind is very important. I think Keynes is reputed to have said, and I should have gone and looked it up because one always gets these quotations wrong, but somebody said he changed his mind. I'm not even sure it was Keynes, but I think it was, and he said, well, when the facts change, sir, I change my mind. What do you do? Which is a very good response. Fred did change his mind. I'm going to give a couple of examples of that in the course of talking about my acquaintance with Fred. Let's begin, however, with the persistence and the doggedness, because Fred, as one knows, was capable of causing a lot of trouble to people who he thought were behaving wrongly. And he thought orthodox economists were behaving wrongly, so he set up a fringe event at the Royal Economic Society in order that the Royal Economic Society, gathered in its august procedure, would not be able to get away from, would not be able to avoid noticing the fact that it actually systematically and regularly excluded a whole body of people from its considerations. The RES was and is unique in this respect. It's the only conference-making organisation I actually know. There must be others, I suppose, but general conference for the profession, which actually chooses whether you're allowed to go and talk to other economists or not. The Eastern Association in America doesn't do it, the equivalent Canadian Association, the Learneds, they don't do it. It's not difficult to go along to it, and certainly if you are deselected, it's not on the grounds that the RES did, which was to say we basically don't agree with you, don't agree with this point of view, we're not going to hear it. And they've persisted in that way of reasoning right up to most recent times, when, irony of ironies, when CHUDE, C-H-U-D-E, Committee of Heads of University Departments of Economics, Andy Dennis and I went along to put the case for pluralism in the context of the subject benchmarking exercise. And it was agreed, I think, with CHUDE that we would present a session at the RES on the need for pluralism in economics. The RES, true to form, rejected the proposal to discuss pluralism, even though the recommendation actually came with the support, as I recall it, of the quasi-official body to whom QAI, at least in theory, entrusts the reorganisation and discussion of curriculum and delivery of economics in Great Britain, which I find quite extraordinary. So Fred wanted to cause them trouble, and he wanted to do this by holding a fringe. And it was a wonderfully subversive event, and it appealed to Fred's soul, I'm sure. Fred, as you probably know, was a vocational anarchist, I think is the best way to describe him. He was claimed to be one of the few remaining members of the International Workers of the World, and proudly wore a Wobbly's badge. And like all anarchists that I've come across, he was formidably well organised, so he organised this fringe event. And it just meant that everybody who was in the RES, it was like the elephant outside the dining room or the camel outside the tent. People kept crossing from one to the other to just see what was going on. It was a public secret. Everybody knew it was there. Then there was a discussion, a very important formative discussion in the history of the AHE, as to whether we should continue trying to organise as a fringe, or we should set a separate organisation up. Now, my memory is that Fred at that time was very firmly in the camp of saying we need to organise a fringe, because he saw that that was a way of causing difficulties that could not be shrugged off, and that's still an issue, by the way. It's still a problem that, in a certain sense, the kind of tacit response of the official RES line towards us is, well, you have your AHE, you go off and do your thing, and therefore we don't need to let you into our proceedings because you've already got yours. I'm sure you've all heard of the classic letter that we received when we tried to organise the second fringe, and Fred actually had us write to the RES, being Fred, and ask for permission, not permission, but you know, ask for them to advertise the fringe and support it and help it. You know, like there are fringe conferences at many events. It's a perfectly normal thing, certainly in the arts world. It's quite celebrated to have a fringe at a number of such events, perhaps not an economics conference. And they wrote back to say they would not allow us to have, they didn't want us to have a fringe because it would appear as if they were excluding us. A classic reply of its kind, which will surely go down in history, and I try and make sure it's remembered at every occasion like this. I'm sure Fred would have wanted us to. So Fred was wanting to cause them that difficulty, but I think eventually, I can't remember the exact sequence of events, but they ended up holding a conference in St Andrews, and by, I don't know, design or coincidence, all the places that one might hold fringe meetings were booked. So it was just impossible, and people said, we'll have to hold a separate meeting this time. But the issue is still there, as I remember it, whether we should go back and set and hold a fringe. And I think we decided not to. And Fred changed his mind. He listened to the discussion and he said, okay, I'm convinced. This is what we have to do. The second time, very important and for me formative, is that Fred, as you may or may not know, had a definite view of what heterodox economics was. He actually believed early in the history of the AHE that heterodox economics was a definite body of coherent thought within itself, in its own mind. There are papers of Fred's which we should try and find, perhaps you've already found them, which say, where he says, look, there is basically an alternative canon to orthodox, to the mainstream, and it is a composition of Marxist, Keynesian, feminist, behaviouralist, institutionalist, I'm sure a Green, I'm sure I've missed somebody out, but he included absolutely everybody. And there were two arguments which I had with Fred, and Andrew Klein were with me about that. We said, look, first of all, we don't agree that there is such a thing as a unified Keynesian economics anyway, and we certainly don't agree there is such a thing as a unified Marxist economics anyway. People who use the labels Keynesian or Marxist all too frequently use it. I know this is controversial, but I'm relating a conversation we had with Fred, so don't stop me, you can't, it's on film. We said you have to allow that Marxists can disagree, and you have to allow that Keynesians can disagree. And it's very good and it's important that they disagree. So there's an element in there that's not covered by your attempt to get an agreement. In a wonderful turn of phrase that I was introduced to by Victoria Chick later on when we were writing the articles up for, I think it was for the CJE special edition, what is involved in attempting to jam together a lot of ideas that don't actually work together is not synthesis, of which economics is very fond of talking. It's actually a syncretism, putting together things that don't work together. And we said, let's try and make them work. No, you've got to understand that, this is the opposition. It was basically the anarchist organiser speaking. I think what he had in mind is that we could get enough people behind us in heterodoxy to actually overturn orthodoxy and put heterodoxy in its place. And from the early days, that was something I was totally opposed to. I've said, no, you want to finish with the existence of orthodoxy altogether. That means pluralism. That means there is no single concrete discipline which dominates. And one of the problems with a lot of heterodox economics is it consists of what I call orthodoxies in waiting, people who think that they really should be the caliph or the vizier without any intended offence to those of religious sensibilities, but I'm describing a temporal setup, the way that the Ottoman Empire was actually ruled. There's a wonderful French character called Isnogoud, who is the vizier, the caliph, he's always the vizier and he wants to be the caliph. And there's a lot of heterodox economists are like that. They're waiting to be the next orthodoxy, and they'll be just as oppressive as the present mainstream, and in the past I think some of them have been. So we don't want that. We want the right to disagree, enshrined in the way that economics works. No, you've got to understand there's a common purpose. This argument, this discussion went on by email. There's an absolute ton of emails I have when I started looking at my intro. I first realised quite how many emails I've had from Fred. And it eventually resolved itself at a time when I think I was trying to explain to Fred why the feminist economists didn't take part. And I said, Fred, it's not just because they go away and they discuss things that we discuss themselves. It's because they have a different point of view. And they're not going to come into a tent which is labelled, here you are part of the same thing as a thing that's run by a bunch of men. And they wouldn't, even if it was run by women either, because they have their own distinct contribution to economics, which is often in conflict with and sheds great light on the defects of the other brands of heterodox economics which you want to get in your big tent. And it's just not going to work, Fred. And I think that was the point at which he really began to think, or I'd like to think that's the point at which he really began to think. And I remember Sheila and I were trying to work out when it was. I think it was around about probably 2007, 2008. Fred got up and we had a business meeting, quite mildly, maybe it was the closure meeting, I can't remember. He just said, and explained why pluralism was actually what we were about, that, you know, the only reason we're actually, I think today, not called the Association for Pluralist Economics, it would be APE or P. I mean, whatever you do, it always goes wrong, so we're stuck, and anyway, historically we're stuck with the AHE, but he basically said, we are a pluralist organisation. And that just goes to show, he said, you can too teach an old dog new tricks. And I don't think I've quite got the accent, but it came across in that wonderful North American Eastish accent of Fred's, which I loved. And it was a turning point, and he had changed his mind. He had changed his mind. So let's put the doggedness beside that and park it for a bit and come back to the doggedness, because Fred was an organiser. I often suspect that he was an organiser before he was an academic, and he knew that things had to be done. He knew that the fringe had to happen, and he did it. He knew that we had to set up the AHE committee, and he made sure it was done. And I can remember when things came along, like the subject benchmarking or the research economic framework, there's always an email in my in-tray from Fred to the committee which says, we have to respond. I would write back and say, Fred, what do you mean by we? And he said, I don't care, anybody, somebody's got to do it. I said, okay, I'm going to do it. He said, that's what I meant. So I wrote the subject benchmark and I wrote the REF answer, not because I thought I was any particularly good at it, but just because it was the only way to get Fred off my back. And then the other side, and here I'm nearly done, of that persistence, which shows up in the academic record, is this wonderful series of articles which university by university, department by department, person by person, discipline by discipline, subject by subject, dissect the closing of the doors to open and free thinking that orthodoxy has carried out in our discipline and in our country. He's just documented, he's showed it, and he showed it in a way which I think is pretty well incontrovertible. I mean, others are now getting, there's now a tremendous movement in France, quite rightly protesting about the fact that nobody has actually been appointed from a heterodox viewpoint to a professorship in France. I think I've got this right, the AFET people can correct me if I'm wrong. I think for some formidable period of time, 20 years. But Fred knew that from 1996. He already knew, and he was already telling us, and he was already pointing out that this was going on. So we didn't just get the wake-up call at the end of the process. We were on the case from the point when that process started, and that doggedness with the very serious scholarship and setting aside time from making a career out of the many things that he did contribute to in terms of economic theory, particularly Kaleckian theory and theory of markup pricing, which I discussed with them endlessly, because it was so good to find that there was another temporalist in the room, which is what Kalecki was, and what's Fred's reading of Kalecki preserved was the temporalism of Kalecki's approach. So that was wonderful. But I think in a certain sense he would have had a more star-studded career if he'd just done what the conventional career academic does, and he'd just sat down and said, look, that's what I'm going to do, and I'll make it a hobby to organise to combat orthodoxy. No, he made it the main thing that he was going to... I think he was right, by the way. I think that's another thing that the new generation of economists has to think about, is if you really want to get economic knowledge out there into the world, that is going to be listened to and used, and not used in the way that it seems to happen at present, which basically is to create victims, not to put too fine a point on it. You may find that you're actually going to have to spend more time fighting for pluralism than you do spending actually doing the economic investigation, because it's the only way to clear out the Augean stables that will allow you to get, to slightly mix a metaphor, will allow you to get the horse out the door before it bolts. That's the only way that you're going to be able to get a space to carry out your economics, to investigate, to go back to the previous theories that were thrown away and are shut out, to use freely the ideas that need to be brought into play to understand this, economy we're living in today, with its crisis, but also with all its new formidably different technologies, you're only going to be able to do that if you put the fight for pluralism at the forefront. And I think that historical record will actually show that at the end of the day, Fred's contribution to economics by that wonderful series of scholarly works is probably greater, accompanied of course by the conferences which I went to in Bremen, another one I missed in Milan, but I remain in contact with the researchers in Europe, putting together patiently European networks, working on the question of bibliometrics, ranking. Fred was one of the first people to understand how ranking was used as a systematic means of reinforcing monotheoretic thought and imposing orthodoxy and single. I think his doggedness is going to last beyond his life, because 6 months ago I received another email from Fred, slightly different this time. He said he was quite calm about it. He just said, "Look, I'm going to die. I've got cancer. It's 6 months is the diagnosis. There may be some remission, but I can't rely on it, and I must make sure that the records are preserved." So I said, "All right, what do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to send you the records." I said, "All right, do that." So all his records, all the researching, all the surveys, all the stuff, all the material he's accumulated about who attended which CSE conference when, going back 30 years, a sort of history of heterodox economics right back to the late 60s, is now sitting in boxes in my room, and we've got to do something with it. Because I think that sort of doggedness up to the moment when he passed away is extraordinary. Self-sacrificing is the word I was looking through earlier when I was trying to use the word altruism. And it's a side of Fred's character which I think was not often recognised, because he could rub people up the wrong way. But he was determined to do what he wanted to have done for the sake of others, not just for the sake of Fred, in fact not even for the sake of Fred. I was briefly on in the Communist Party. Not a lot of people know that, but one of the things that was around was a little jocular song, some of you may know it, some of you may not, about Harry Pollitt, who was the secretary of the Communist Party at the same time as my dad was in it actually, and had died just after I joined, I believe. And it was about Harry was a Bolshevik, and he dies and he goes to heaven, and he organised the angels and he brought them out on strike. Harry went to heaven, but the hymns he did not like, so he organised the angels and he brought them out in strike. And they put him in the heavenly choir, put a harp into his hand, but he sang the Internationale in the Hallelujah Band. And at the end of the day of that song, they bring him up in front of the Holy Ghost, and they find him guilty of spreading disaffection amongst the heavenly host, which I think was Fred's mission in life, particularly given the heavenly role that orthodox economics seems to have assigned for itself. And they send Harry down to hell, and 20 years pass, and Harry's doing well, and all the little devils have joined the YCL, that's the Young Communist League to you. So I like to think that Fred is singing the Internationale in the Hallelujah Band, and I like to think he's organising angels to bring them out on strike. I like to think that he's spreading a lot of disaffection amongst the heavenly host, and if he goes to the other place, and if the other place exists, of course, but this is a jocular mode of reasoning, then I think he'll probably cause the devil more trouble than he causes the people up there, and I hope he does. So here's to you, Fred.